Good day, welcome to lesson 6. Today we are going to be looking at an introduction to the National Spatial Development Guidelines for Trinidad and Tobago. So this is actually a summary taken from the National Spatial Development Strategy. That's a large document that has been produced with the intent of providing guidelines for holistic spatial development throughout the nation of Trinidad and Tobago. So the National Spatial Development, that is what the NSDS stands for, National Spatial Development Strategy. Now before the NSDS, we had the National Physical Development Plan, that's the NPDP. And this was previously used to guide physical development across the nation. Now the intent of this these guidelines, it was intended to be updated every 5 years. However, the National Physical Development Plan has not been updated since 1984. So we can see that continuous review and updated never really took place. The National Spatial Development Strategy, on the other hand, was intended to replace that NPDP and to cover a period from 2013 to 2023. Right, so bear in mind, initially we had the NPDP, National Physical Development Plan, which guided physical development only. The National Spatial Development Strategy replaced that plan for the period until 2013. Now the NSDS, the National Spatial Development Strategy, provides the framework or the guidelines for decisions about the ways in which the national space across Trinidad and Tobago would be used and how it would be developed for the next decade and beyond. So according to the document, when we talk about space, space includes land, water and air. So any kind of development in any one of those spheres are supposed to be guided by the NSDS. And this is the responsibility of not only the government of Trinidad and Tobago, but the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Because once government guides and attempt to implement development policies, it is really up to the people to make it work. This particular strategy was designed in such a way that it can be reviewed and amended and updated as necessary. And this is always a wise strategy to have, because even as things change, you have to be prepared. Your guidelines must be flexible, because we don't know everything, we don't know all. So it must be flexible and it must be possible to amend and change and refine any kind of plan that you have. So the spatial development strategy, what that means is it is a process of transformation that places the needs of the people at the heart of strategies for sustainable development. So we all know the definition of sustainable development, and this is what makes the spatial development strategy very much different from the National Physical Development Plan, in the sense that the National Physical Development Plan focuses mainly on the physical development of different infrastructure, etc., whereas the spatial development strategy is a more holistic approach. It actually looks at the needs of the people as in terms of how the national resources can actually be utilized in a sustainable way while meeting the current needs of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. So please bear in mind, there is a distinct difference between the NSDS and the NPDP. So the National Spatial Development Strategy are development guidelines. Those guidelines will need different legislation to facilitate the implementation of those plans. And some of those legislation may include the Town and Country Planning Act of 1969, as well as the Planning and the Facilitation of Development Bill, which at the compiling of this document that we are talking about was yet to be enacted. Those are two examples of legislation that would facilitate the implementation of the NSDS across Trinidad and Tobago. Now, at the government level, for example, the Tobago House of Assembly and municipal corporations, as well as local communities, they will be given more influence over the planning and development of their jurisdiction. So the local government in each one of those areas will have a certain amount of control over the development that takes place. Now, local government will be involved in the development of plans for their own areas as well as development control. So what that means is we have the NSDS, which is a national policy, a national development policy, which would have been developed at the highest levels, governmental levels, for example. But for the implementation to take place, it must happen at the local levels. So each local jurisdiction must have a customized development plan for their municipal corporation. And these plans, these localized plans, must fit into the larger requirements of the NSDS. So remember, the NSDS is a framework or guidelines based on the high level vision for the national development. Okay, and in terms of development control at the local government level, an example of this may be the approval of applications for development. So at the local government level, they would be able to control and make a determination and say development A has been approved for development because it fits within our local development plan, or development B, you reject that approval because it does not fit into the development plan. So the NSDS provides the strategic context for plans and decisions that would be made at all levels. Now let's look briefly at the scope of the NSDS. So land use planning has traditionally focused on the regulation and control of land, with little attention being given to guiding development itself. In terms of guiding development in a broad context, so the land use planning focus was very narrow in terms of regulation and control of development. And I already gave you an example of a control of development, such as approvals for development. Okay, so the spatial planning approach takes a wider and more exclusive view on development. For example, it addresses economic, social, and environmental matters in an integrated way, because it's really not possible for you to have development occurring isolated in any one of those areas, because everything in the environment is so fluid and interconnected. So the aim of the spatial development strategy is to achieve optimum use of national space. Let's look briefly at the NSDS process. So the spatial planning process involves the following. We start with fact gathering or information gathering. As we all know, once you have information, the next step would be to analyze the data. You would want to investigate the data to determine trends and patterns. This gives you an understanding of what is really happening out there in the environment or within your nation. Your findings from your analysis process will inform the development of any policies that you have. Once you have a policy or guidelines for development in place, the next step is implementation. As we mentioned before, one of the things that you would need in order to facilitate implementation would be legislation. Once implementation has been completed, or even in the process of being completed, monitoring and review must be taking place. It must be an ongoing process. And please note, it is critical that you have stakeholder participation at all levels. So if you really want to have effective spatial planning, if, as you already recall, we said this is a holistic approach, it means that all the groups or special interest groups that would be affected by the development, they must have an input. They must have a say in the policies and the planning process that occurs. So this process will also happen at the local government level. So note, it's not only happening at the high levels of national government, it must also be at the local government level. And also, information that is generated at the local government level would be fed back into the NSDS for the purpose of monitoring and review. So any refining of the NSDS that needs to take place can continue. So let's look briefly at the NSDS, the vision of the NSDS. So this vision is taken exactly out of the document for you. Alright, so it says by 2033, Trinidad and Tobago will be a nation where people enjoy a high quality of life within a safe, healthy, inclusive, and sustainable physical, socio-economic, and cultural environment. So any kind of project that you are about to embark on, you must always have a vision. It doesn't really matter whether the vision at a particular point in time seems feasible or not, but you must have a vision. You must have something to work towards. And this is a vision of the NSDS. Now, anytime you have a vision, the next step is to have objectives. Objectives are what would, you must define objectives in order to facilitate the achievement of the vision that you have defined. So according to the NSDS, there are 12 objectives which have been grouped under 3 themes, right? And these objectives, as I mentioned before, are directly related to the achievement of the vision that you have defined. Now the 3 groups or the 3 themes are as follows. You have strong and resilient communities, so this would be the social focus. Then you will have sustainable prosperity, the focus here would be economic. And then we also look at sustainable infrastructure. Your focus here would be the built environment. So remember, even though we have 3 objectives here, these objectives as we go forward would be by no means treated in isolation of the others. Alright, remember, it is the NSDS is a holistic, integrated approach. Please note that each of the above themes will be dealt with in further detail in the next lesson, lesson 7. The NSDS strategies. So there are 3 strategies that were considered for achieving the vision and objectives of the NSDS. In other words, we've already identified a vision. The objectives have been broken down in order to identify the way forward in achieving the vision. So now you have strategies. So strategies would be like methodologies. How are we going to achieve the vision and objectives? So 3 strategies were identified. The first being harmonized regional development. This approach addresses the economic, social, and environmental considerations in a holistic, integrative way. Dispersed development, this is the second one. This approach will likely see growth in regional and local centers across Trinidad and Tobago, with restricted growth within the east-west and north-south urban corridors. Now remember, at present, this is where most of our urban areas are located, in those regions. However, there could be negative consequences for current major urban centers leading to decline in those areas. So what we're saying here for this approach, you're looking to restrict development in the current urban centers and open up development in other areas and localize communities across the country. But by shifting your focus in such a way, it can lead to the decline and the dying of the current urban centers. The third approach or strategy would be concentrated development. So this results in economic growth in the existing centers and the key corridors. So this is opposite to dispersed development now, whilst retaining development outside the main urban, restraining development outside the main urban centers. So now you're focusing your attention on the urban centers and you're restricting development outside. This approach now also is likely to have negative consequences, because now what it does is it exacerbates the already existing inequalities in development across the country. Right? So what we have is, after analysis of the three approaches, it was determined that the harmonized regional development approach was more suitable. So this was the approach that was selected in order to have a more fair and equitable approach to development across the nation. So let us look briefly at development policies. So the core development policies of the NSDS utilizes the harmonized regional development approach, as mentioned before. So if we use this approach now, for this approach, there are 4 areas under which we will look at development, spatial development across Trinidad and Tobago. And these 4 areas would be aiming for sustainability, strong and resilient communities, as we mentioned before, sustainable prosperity, and sustainable infrastructure. So every policy, even at the various levels, whether it's local government level or regional, etc., every development policy must address each of these 4 areas. So all spatial development plans at all levels should be consistent with both the core policies, the vision, and the objectives. So at this point, I want to say thank you for joining me for today's lesson. It was a brief lesson and brief introduction to the NSDS. Please proceed to this week's activities. Thank you for your time.